Bob Hawke, AC, was our Prime Minister from 1983 till 91, and during that time he embedded a relationship between Australia and China whose contours are still developing, as we know. It's really an epic story of our time, a drama in which many of us are playing our own, maybe small part, and in which I think many of us will be invited to play a part. And quite how much we take up that invitation, I think, will play a great role in determining just how successful Australia is in this century. But our special guest this evening did not seem to have hesitated one moment when China, the emerging new China, clearly wanted a relationship with us on terms that hadn't been available earlier. That was back in 1983. It was just a month after Mr. Hawke was first elected, when Premier Zhao Ziyang paid the first visit to Australia by a Chinese head of state, and he laid the groundwork for a much more expansive set of exchanges in ensuing years. And the rest is virtually history, as they say. So this evening we're going to trace the chronology of Mr. Hawke's involvement with China, which I actually don't think, I think Bob Carr and I agree, hasn't really been given enough attention. The sweep of his policies towards China, which are very interesting, as you'll see, is an incredible trajectory, which I think offers us a lot of hope, really, for the future. His hopes for China, his concerns too, of course, his very personal involvement. Because last month he returned from his 101st visit, he told me, to China, and that's the ballast, I think, behind one of his proudest boasts, that he is a true friend of China. That China knows it, and that he knows it, and that it really is the basis, I think, for much of his approach, that he sees himself as a true friend of China. So what does that mean? Well, welcome, Mr. Hawke. Thank you for your time. Delighted to have you join us. Just for overall context to start, in the broad spectrum of your prime ministership, where do you rate this developing relationship?
Right up near the top. Of course, the most important part of the prime ministership was restructuring the Australian economy. But within that major exercise that I undertook with my colleagues, the developing relationship with China was an integrally important part of that.
Did it take you by surprise almost? I mean, when you look back with all the things that were confronting you in '83, was China there into the forefront or not?
Oh yes, I was very conscious. I made my first visit in 1978. I was head of the ACTU then, and a lot of the very left-wing unions were going up there, and they're coming back and saying, you must go up there, they want you to visit. But I refused to go while the Gang of Four was still there. But once the Gang of Four were out, I decided I'd go, so I went up. So fortunately, my time with China absolutely coincides with the reform period initiated by Deng Xiaoping at the end of 1978. So I was very conscious of the important changes that were occurring in China, and I said at my first press conference for international correspondence just soon after I became Prime Minister, I said then that more than anything else, the most important external factor determining the future economic welfare of Australia would be our increasing enmeshment with Asia in general and China in particular. So I had it very much at the forefront of my mind right from the beginning.
Just go through a chronology, because there you are, March the 11th, you win the election, April the 18th.
March the 5th.
Yeah. I've got March the 11th.
You're knocking a week off, darling.
Pardon me, okay.
They're all important.
On the 18th of April, to the best of my knowledge, Premier Zhao visits Australia. the first visit from a Chinese head of government to Australia. And in your welcoming toast to the Premier, you declared the policies of containment and isolationism of the 50s and 60s are no more than a bad memory. Now, I'm going to come to this later, but regrettably I heard Bob Blackwell, for instance, a very important US analyst, just the other day proposing once more policies of containment, which must perturb you.
Yes, very short-sighted and portraying a very fundamental lack of understanding of China and its position in the region.
So tell it, that first visit and Premier Zhao.
Well, there are very few things that I felt indebted to Malcolm Fraser for, but one of them was the fact that he had issued this invitation to Jiang Zemin to visit. And of course the election intervened, and instead of it being Malcolm welcoming him, it was myself. And Zemin and I hit it off immediately. He was a remarkably able man. So we remembered that Deng Xiaoping picked him up. He was governor of the far west province, the Sichuan. He had no experience of international affairs. He was a good governor, and Deng Xiaoping brought him in. And what was remarkable about him was not just his capacity to implement the economic thinking and policy of Deng Xiaoping, but he very quickly became not just conversant with, but knowledgeable in the realm of international affairs. You could sit down and talk with him about any range of international issues, apartheid and so on, and he could speak intelligently about these issues. And we just got on famously.
You said he wasn't naturally a gregarious extrovert man, though. You developed a relationship with him. He was a reflective man.
Yes, but I found it easy. I found it personally easy to get on with him. We were on the same wavelength, and I think perhaps it's best illustrated by the fact that he, of course, invited me to visit China the following year, and so I, of course, accepted. We went up there and we were having the meeting with our ambassador before we had the meeting with Jiang, and we went through the thing, and I said to the ambassador, I said, there's another matter I want to raise with Jiang, and he said, oh, Prime Minister, what's that? I said, I have this view that we ought to talk about moving towards a much closer integration of our iron ore and steel industries, and I want to propose that China should enter into a joint venture with the iron ore mine in Western Australia. He said, oh, you can't do that, Prime Minister. I said, what do you mean I can't do that? I said, oh, there hasn't been any prior discussion about that with officials. So in a manner which you could imagine, I very politely told him where he could go and what he could do with his thinking.
Advice.
And so we went to the meeting, and we went through the program, and at the end I just raised this issue with Jiang, and such was our rapport. He immediately responded positively, agreed, and within 12 months Hui Bang was out there, out in Mount Chana with me, and that was the beginning of what remains a fundamental part of the economic relationship.
Yes, that's so. You went back in '84, and then there was this agreement to integrate Australia's and China's iron and steel industries. You also announced, I think, in that same visit that Australia would establish a consul general in Shanghai, which was quite a move as well.
Yes, well, it made sense. There was no doubt in my mind that the relationship with China was going to become our most important relationship. And it's such a vast country, it didn't make any sense just to have your embassy in Beijing and not have representatives in major areas.
And Also, the plans were to set up a first conference of Chinese and Australian senior executives would be held the following year in Beijing. The first step in strengthening business connections at a high level. It's amazing now to think none of that was happening. I mean, I suppose there's so much happening now, but you were conscious, were you, that there was just a complete tabula rasa at that point?
Yeah, well, of course it had to be developed, and had to be developed quickly because. It reflected the way in which we were handling the situation within Australia. I mean, it was very much a triangular arrangement we had here with the government and the trade unions and business, and that had to be reflected with as much and deep an involvement as possible of Australian businesses with China, both them up there and Chinese businesses in Australia. It's not rocket science.
Did you get good prompting from back here, or were people pushing back against you? No, but were they pushing back, or were they ready for what you were offering?
No, they were ready.
They were ready. Okay. So 1985. Hu Yaobang, General Secretary Hu Yaobang and Secretariat member Hu Qili visit Australia. Now, he was a very different sort of character, wasn't he?
Yaobang he looked like a little bright bird, and he was a very chirpy fellow, and it was a very funny story. You'd be in a meeting with him, and he'd have all these officials there, and they'd have their prepared papers, they'd all have their documents, and be going on. All of a sudden, Yaobang would shut the cover and go off at a tangent. And I look at these people, and they'd be nearly shitting themselves. So I remember that on this visit, I was up there in 84. Hu Yaobang had gone out to the Sichuan province with me, and then he was going back to Beijing, and I was at the Guangzhou. I was getting the plane there back to Australia, and Hu Qili's offside was with me. And when we were there, I said, Hu Qili, do you mind if I ask you a sort of rather personal question? He said, oh, of course, Prime Minister. So I said, what's it like for you people when Hu Yaobang sort of closes the book and goes off at a tangent? He said, Prime Minister, it terrifies us.
He was a lot of fun. In fact, you might tell us the story because he and you went up to Mount Channa in the Pilbara, which was the first joint iron ore mine in 1990. But that visit was rather fun, wasn't it, up in the Pilbara with him?
Yeah, that was 85.
Yes, but this is in 85. Wasn't that when you both went to the Pilbara?
In 85?
Yeah.
I thought you said 90.
No, well, the mine opened in 90.
The mine opened, yeah. We went up there, it was, there's a marvellous photo of it. I've got it back up there in China, and it's, look at Yaobang and myself there up on the side of the mountain, and I'm very proud of that photo because it really was the beginning of this fantastic relationship, which has been so important for Australia, and particularly during the time of the global financial crisis, the sustained demand by China during that period for our products in general and iron ore in particular was fundamentally important to the way we came through that crisis.
Then in 1986, you go back to China and you meet Deng Xiaoping for the first time, which must have been quite a thrill.
Yeah, it was, absolutely. He truly a remarkable man. We sort of had the triple resurrection, basically, and he was physically remarkably one of the shortest men I've ever met, and the only literally chain smoker I ever met. He was literally a chain smoker, and just light the one within, and it was rather funny. We were sitting in the great hall with the people. He was sitting there, and I was sitting here, and there was a spittoon between us, and he wasn't the most accurate projector in the world, and my Prime Minister's shoes got a bit of a shine on it. I said to I said to the blokes after, I said, how we can make a fortune? We can shine these shoes, the only shoes in the world shined by the spittle of the paramount leader of China. But that was just an idle, by the way, thing. He had a remarkable mind. He was intellectually, first class and thoroughly pragmatic. The decision that he made in '78 wasn't taken lightly. He sent delegations of Chinese officials to Europe and to America to look at the operation of the market system, and then he studied those reports and then made his decision. Remarkable man.
Was he the sort of person whom you felt listened? Like, was he interested in people, or was he a big picture man purely, or did he have that capacity to do both?
Well, all I can say is we certainly had a marvellous interchange. I listened to him and he listened to me. I couldn't have asked for a better audience in terms of the things I wanted to say. Generally, and what I saw as the prospects for China in general, and its relationship with the region and with Australia in particular, and he was very responsive. He was a marvellous man to deal with.
One of the characters of your life. And in September 1986, I should say in May, you were the first person to receive an honorary doctorate from Nanjing University, awarded to a non-Chinese person, I think, if I'm right. And in September, a joint ministerial economic commission was established. So these were really substantial developments. It's funny, I'm not conscious, remembering back. I had to go back and look. There was so much happening at that time. As an Australian, it's terrific to be reminded of what was unfolding. And then in 1987, the Mount China joint venture is signed between China's Ministry of Metallurgy, which is now Sino-Steel, and Hamersley Iron Ore. And we moved to this extraordinary year of 1989. In April the 15th, 1989, your friend Hu Yaobang dies of a heart attack, and the protests in Tiananmen Square begin. May the 19th, Zhao Ziyang enters Tiananmen and pleads with the students to end their hunger strikes and protests, knowing that martial law was to be imposed. And of course, on this day, June the 4th, 1989, the protests end with the government crackdown. Can you summon up some of your memories of that time?
Well, yes, and take it on beyond there too, if you'd like. I think one of the profound tragedies was that, and I'm not in this way trying in any way to excuse anything of the tough decisions and the tragic decisions that were taken by the leadership, but one of the tragedies was that the young woman leader of the protesting students didn't respond positively to Zhao Ziyang's plea. He went out there and he pleaded with her, he said, get them out. He said, we will ensure that changes are made, but there was no positive response and tragic consequences followed. I was in the situation where just before I had to go out on the stage here in Australia and respond, I'd just moments before received the cables from our embassy in Beijing setting out the tragic and gruesome details of the deaths of the people in Tiananmen Square. So I was terribly upset, and I reflected how I felt and said what I had to say, and I just made the decision on the spot that the Chinese students here in Australia would be permitted to stay. And when I went off the stage, the senior bureaucrat said, Prime Minister, you can't do that. I said, it's done. no staying, and they have proved marvellous.
42,000, I think, were eventually.
Marvellous citizens. Would you like me to go on to...
No, well, it's just, I wonder what you mean, the tragedy for Zhao Ziyang. He was charged with splitting the party, supporting chaos. He was placed under house arrest for the next 16 years till his death. I always found that terribly sad. But could you see that coming for him?
No, it was extraordinarily sad of him. I just had the opportunity of seeing him once after that, the golf course. They allowed him to go and play golf, and I just saw him very briefly once. Didn't play golf with him, but it was very, very sad for him, because he had been an immeasurably important figure in implementing the decision of Deng Xiaoping. And I mean, I don't know whether at this point you want me to talk about it later on, but you know, just the importance of that decision of 1978 by Deng Xiaoping simply cannot be overestimated.
And he was, of course, central to following through on this. Zhao. This is what I find such a, you know, when you look at Zhao's career, the fact that he was not able to intervene, could he not see what was coming with those student protests?
Well, and that's why he was the one who was proposing that, you know, that they be prepared to make changes. And he personally went out and made the offer. He was as far across it as he could be, but the forces were too big for him.
Mm. Now, I mean, you were supposed to visit there in October of that year, but that visit was cancelled, and there was no contact, or effectively your contacts lapsed for 3 years.
Yep.
But what is really interesting is that you accepted an invitation to return in 1993, where you were met by President Jiang Zemin.
Well, the story is very interesting. I, of course, will not countenance the severance of diplomatic relations, but the personal relationship went to deep freeze. And as you say, until I'd finished as Prime Minister, there was no further personal interchange. But then I was sitting in my office in here in Sydney, and we got the message from the Chinese consul, could he come and see me? And I said, yes, of course. And he came, and he was sort of embarrassed for a while. And he said that he'd been instructed by his government to ask me if I'd be prepared to make a visit to China. And I said, yes, of course I would. Because as far as I was concerned, I wanted to go forward, not forgetting what had happened, but I wanted to go forward because the relationship was so important. So I went up there, and I think it's worth telling, because it shows something about, you know, the deep intelligence and thinking of the leadership. I went up there, and you don't have your appointment made in advance as to the exact time. You go and you put up in the state guest house, the Doogue, and you wait there. And so the message came that Jiang Zemin was ready to see me. So I went down to the Forbidden City, and I walked in, and there was this big room, and Jiang Zemin was sitting there with his sort of inner cabinet. There was about 6 of them. And I walked across the room, and Jiang Zemin got up and he walked out towards me. He said, Mr. Hawke, there's one thing I want to say to you. And I thought, shit, what's this? And he held his hand and he said, Mr. Hawke, China never forgets its friends, and we want you to know that we regard you as one of our best friends. Now, it was marvellous, because they'd understood that my tears had been out of love for China and the Chinese people, and they'd understood this, and they were welcoming me back. It was a marvellous moment.
Were you anxious? Did you think that would happen?
Well, I didn't quite know what would happen. I was very pleasantly surprised at the depth and the sincerity with which he said these things.
And, well, let's actually take that into what lessons we can still learn. I mean, has that sense of a special friendship between you, even this is post-office now, I'm talking about post-Prime Ministership. Do you feel you've kept developing that?
Yes, all doors are open to me up there. I have the opportunity, and I'm obviously engaged in some commercial activities, representing some Australian companies, representing Chinese companies here, but I also engage in discussions with people at quite senior levels over there, and particularly over the last couple of years have spent quite a bit of time with the Chinese International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is an extremely high-level body, and it's sort of under the auspices of the PLA, but the head of it was the last head of security intelligence in the PLA, and they look at issues of strategic importance for China in the region and around the world, and so I do have the opportunity of talking with them about some very important issues, and I always look forward to that, because you're talking with people who help to make decisions there.
Pull some of the levers. Are you able to propose challenging things to them in terms of?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things that I'm currently talking with them about. One is, of course, the question which is very much in the news at the moment about the South China Sea. When I was up there the time before last, I said to them that it seemed to me that what would make sense would be that they should call a meeting of the other 5 states who have claims in the region, that China should convene a meeting and offer to set up a structure for a joint development of resources in the region. And they said they thought that was a good idea, and they said, we will work on that, and it will take some time. So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I do know that they took that suggestion very seriously, and they were working on it, and I do hope that something comes of that. Another issue of even broader importance was that I observed 2 years ago that for the first time China was taking a very direct interest in affairs in the Middle East, and they had in the 1 year both Netanyahu and the head of the Palestinian Authority separately in Beijing, and this was an indication of the importance they are now attaching to this region. And so I raised with them, I said, because I had an ongoing interest in this area myself, and I said to them that I thought that the United States had basically fallen down on the job. I think President Obama's heart's in the right place. I think he's a good man, but I don't think he's taken the tough leadership that he should have in this region in trying to get the parties together. And I said to the Chinese, of course, the Palestinians and the Muslims, Arabs generally, don't trust the United States. They regard the United States as just been the protector of Israel and looking after Israel's interest. I said, I think it would change the chemistry of the situation entirely if you would say to the United States, let's sit down together and try and bang their heads together and get this. So they had a very positive response to that. They thought that was a good idea. And when I was in America recently, I had a talk with my old friend George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State when I was Prime Minister. And it may be that there are going to be some meetings between my colleagues in the CAAS with whom I spoke on this issue and with our American friends. But it's my hope that they would see the merit of China and America thing, then it would not only be very important on that issue of the Middle East of maximising the chance of getting some possible resolution, but the fact of working together on that would also have very beneficial spin-offs in regard to their own relationships.
Well, it would be an extraordinary development, and that would be part of China emerging as a sort of a responsible international citizen.
Yeah.
That's the way you...
Yeah.
Would they want to get involved in that intractable dispute? I mean, they've
Well, as I said, they started 2 years ago, and I didn't sort of manufacture this. They invited the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of the Palestinian Authority. So they've indicated their commitment. And it's not with a view to trying to establish some Chinese presence or authority there. It's simply that they see correctly that region and that issue as a continuing flashpoint for world peace.
And just going back to that first very interesting idea about the possibility of some instrument that shared the resources of the South China Sea, that again is, I mean, I realise you say it's nascent and it has to be developed, but is there any sort of model that you can see anywhere in the world that could...
No, you don't need to worry about models. Just in these things, if you get an acceptance of the concept, working the model out, it's a child's play. And
your reading of the surrounding countries is that they might accept this?
Well, I think they would, and I think they should. What interest have they got in the conflict? If you're looking at the self-interest for these countries, it's much better served by a non-belligerent situation, and one of which is getting some share of the resources.
So it just takes it out of that whole strategic rivalry, you think, or it certainly reduces that. How would it be viewed inside China itself? I mean, what's very interesting when you look at China is that there's an international audience and then there's a very, very strong domestic audience. How would you read that?
Well, the Chinese are very proud of their nation and of its achievements, and they have every right to be, and at some stage I hope we'll be able to really look at the question of just how significant their achievements have been in economic terms. But the Chinese are extraordinarily proud of the fact that they've achieved historically unprecedented economic growth, lifted $500 million people out of poverty, and they're proud of their nation as they're entitled to be. And there is no doubt that while China's not a democracy, there's no doubt that the leadership in their thinking and planning take into account the nationalistic pride of their people.
It hasn't set up too many expectations in terms of, there's worries in some people's minds that there's a nationalism demon there that you don't want to let loose.
No, I think it's overstating the situation.
I just want to quote something that actually Kissinger wrote in his recent book on Chinese exceptionalism. China's splendid isolation nurtured a particular Chinese self-perception. Chinese elites grew accustomed to the notion that China was unique, not just a great civilization among others, but civilization itself. Has that ever struck you?
Well, of course, you look at the achievements of the Chinese people over the years. It has been remarkable in economic terms and cultural terms. They are, by any objective test you want to apply, a truly remarkable people with a truly remarkable achievement. As I said to one of my American friends a couple of years ago when China was emerging towards becoming the #1 economy in the world, and he was expressing some sort of quasi-grief about this. I said, well, what you've got to remember is when they do that, they'll just be resuming the position they've occupied for most of the last 2,500 years.
Nevertheless, they send out sometimes contradictory messages. Like Alan Dupont, who I think is a very good observer here in Australia, he sometimes sees a gap between what China says it wants, to be just a good international citizen, not to be afraid of it, and then some of the contradictions in what it does. And trying to read that, he thinks, causes tension.
Well, yeah, but China's not unique in this respect. I mean, if you wanted me to give you a catalogue of, for instance, our great friends in the United States, what they assert as objectives with some of the things they've done. I mean, I'm not here to justify everything that China has said or done, but it's inevitable when you are going through this historic period where you're moving from a situation where just as recently as the end of the 1970s, they're amongst the poorest countries in the world. It's now when they're the biggest economy in the world, and they are making the justifiable assumption that if you look at history, then countries that have grown in economic might and power, particularly those that come to the top, are entitled to have a significant say in the relations between nations. I don't find this exceptional, and I can understand that at times things will be said that it may be upsetting, but the basic thing that's got to be understood is this, that if you look at history, China is not an hegemonistic nation. It's 2015 now. 610 years ago, Admiral Ho made the first of 7 historic naval expeditions from China. Now, just remember this, there were 320 ships, 28,000 crews and soldiers, and they went from China down through Southeast Asia, through the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, got right down the east coast of Africa. Not one attempt in that first of the 7 voyages, or in the subsequent 6 voyages, to colonise in any way. They were doing then what they're doing another way now, opening up trade opportunities. This new emerging economic giant is not some new Soviet Union, some hegemonistic power. And that's what we've got to understand. True it is that they will do and say some things that will be upsetting. But a peaceful international and regional environment has been a sine qua non of their economic development, where they've had this economic miracle. And I do want to say something, to spell out, because I keep talking about the economic miracle, but I don't think people really do understand, Geraldine, the dimension of what China's done. As I say, they were one of the poorest nations on earth. Deng Xiaoping comes along. Now, that decision that was taken by Deng Xiaoping to move China towards a market economy and open up to the outside world, as I've said on a number of occasions, is the single most important political decision made in peacetime by any leader in the 20th century. Far and away, the single most important decision. Why? Firstly, what it did to China. It initiated a period of economic expansion never before anywhere near approached at any point in the history of the world, averaging 10% per annum real growth for a very long period, lifting 500 million people out of poverty. And so it was enormously important for China and for its growth. But and people do understand that it was important in helping the region, and certainly we understand it was important helping us. But what people don't understand is what it did to the global market economy. It totally transformed it. It brought the best part of 3 billion people into the global market economy. First of all, there's China itself, at 1.3 billion. But that was just the beginning. Look at the impact of the Soviet Union. In my talks with the leadership, Jiang, I can still remember, I said to him, the Soviet must be fascinated by what you're doing here. And he said, Prime Minister, he said, every single day, thousands of Soviet officials and citizens cross the border and come in and witness the transformation of this country, the lifting of standards of our presidents. They go back and report it. There is absolutely no question at all that what China did in transforming its economy against the sclerotic state of the Soviet Union was one of the fundamental reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's 1.3 billion there. Then, so the Soviet Union and its satellites. But what's not sufficiently understood is the impact on India. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, India had not been a command economy like the Soviet, but it was not an open economy. It was very much attached to the Soviet Union. And as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, that saw the beginning of the opening up of the Indian economy. So you see what that decision Deng Xiaoping did. 1.3 billion Chinese, over a billion Indians, that's part of half a billion Soviet Union, brought from command or semi-command economies into the world market system. Do you have any wonder that I describe this as the single most important political decision made by any leader in the 20th century?
Oh, I mean, it is. It's enthralling. I mean, you've obviously found it enthralling. I find it enthralling too. I don't think enough Australians find it enthralling, though. I mean, you'd presumably like to see a lot more average Australians absorbed in this story.
Not only average Australians, I wouldn't mind some of the leadership to get a bit more enthralled.
How should it happen? How would you like to see it unfold?
Oh, well, you're talking about an idealistic situation. I do the best I can when I have an opportunity to talk and tell the story, but I'm not here to tell Australians how to behave, Geraldine. I just wish they would think more.
What about the Americans? Because that wonderful story you tell, I mean, makes the Americans nervous quite clearly, and they see it as, it's them or us. And Hugh White said it's in our interest to reduce that strategic rivalry.
Of course it is. Yeah, there's absolutely no future whatsoever in conflict. No future for the United States or for anyone in conflict between China and the United States. As I say. For China, a peaceable regional environment and world environment has been a sine qua non of this marvellous achievement. And that's why they are not going to, in the end, jeopardise that situation. And I just hope that the Americans will understand the importance of this.
Do you think are you worried? I mean, a final question before I open up to questions. Best hopes and worst fears for China. How would you answer me?
Best hopes and worst fears? Well, this is just from my point of view, not talking to look at it from an American point of view.
No, I'm talking about your point of view.
Yeah. Well, the best hope is that the sort of dialogue in regard to the South China Sea will be worked out in a sort of way I've talked about. It'll be a great hope, that will work, that China would issue the invitation and there could be a joint development of the resources in the region. That's best hope. Worst fears, well, I suppose the worst fear is that there'll be a reaction from the United States to some of the developments there that China is making there in the South China Sea, and that led to conflict. That would be, the worst case situation. But I'm basically an optimist.
So flyovers and sort of, in other words, you're saying that a mature ability by America to see some of this as...
What we need is good leaders, good leaders. I've said before already, this needs to be understood and thought about. We are at an absolutely unique point in human history. Absolutely unique, for two reasons, and they're related. One is that because of the technological genius of mankind, for the first time in the whole of history, we have the opportunity either of lifting the quality and standard of living of all mankind on the one hand, or destroying life as we know it on the planet. That's one of the reasons why it's unique. The other, unfortunately, unique point in history at this time is that for the first time since the end of the Second World War, there is not one outstanding political leader in any democracy anywhere in the world. And these are two things that should worry us, because we need a situation where we have leaders supported by people to ensure that we go down the right path of those two alternatives that confront mankind.
Well, I'm going to hand over and suggest that people might like to ask some questions. If you'd mind identifying yourself, please, and state questions preferably rather than statements. So who'd like to, would anybody like to kick off? Yes, please, down the back.
Thank you, Geraldine, for such a good interview, because I listen to your program every Saturday morning. Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Hawke, my name is Leonard Yong. I'm kind of a China specialist, focusing on Chinese civilization. Mr. Hawke, I'd like to find out about your views in terms of China. Do you think China would adopt democracy in the long run? If so, why not? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. Let me say this. If you really hated China, you would impose democracy on it today. It's not ready for democracy yet. But I have had discussions about this with the leadership, with Jiang Zemin, and they recognised that economic reform had to come first, and if they were going to make the economic reform that was envisaged by Deng Xiaoping, that was only going to be effected under the command regime of the Communist Party. But they said to me that they were certain that economic reform would lead to political reform. They wouldn't give me a date on it. They said no one. They were very frank. They said, we can't put timetables on this. But it was their view that inevitably down the track, economic reform would lead to political reform. And I think that's so. I mean, obviously China is not a free, democratic, liberal society now, but it's an infinitely freer and more liberal society today than it was in 1978.
There's some debate about that at the moment. Certainly since 78, but Xi Jinping is certainly behaving he's clamping down in all sorts of ways.
I don't think there's any knowledgeable person in the world today who knows anything about it who would deny that proposition.
About 78, all right, I accept 78, but...
Do you see the closer and deeper economic ties other countries having with China, including Australia, will restrain or coerce their influence on China's on issues like democracy and freedom of speech?
Well,
do you see the closer economic ties, will that have an effect of sort of changing or coercing? I think actually it was a very interesting verb you used, coercing or restraining China in terms of, say, democracy or freedom of speech?
now, the obvious answer to that question is this. If one is concerned about the relative lack of freedom and democracy in China, the obvious truth is you've got much more chance of having some impact about that if you have a good relationship with the Chinese leadership and the Chinese people and let them see and understand the merits of our system. I mean, again, not rocket science. It's so obvious. You've got more chance if you have the relationship than if you don't. This doesn't mean that you're going to say, we are going to be able to change them overnight or in years. But it is an obvious truth. You've got more chance if you have the close relationship than not.
How does one criticise? Do you criticise?
Of course I do. I mean, I don't go up there and say, oh, well done, chaps, you're going beautifully. And they wouldn't respect me if I did. Where there are issues, I raise them. But I must say it's much better to discuss these issues privately than get up in the public pulpit, as is unfortunately sometimes the tendency of our American friends.
You talked a little bit about the relationship between China and America. I was just wondering about the relationship between China and Japan. There often seems to be friction between those two countries. How do you see that playing out in the future?
It's a good question. Again, I think in the end the answer is that ultimately common sense and an intelligent judgment of self-interest will mean that there won't be conflict. I mean, you've got those rocks in the island up there. In the end, I think in the assessment of intelligent self-interest by both the Chinese and the Japanese leadership is going to say, this is not worth war. That's my judgment.
There's a great line from Kissinger too. I think he thinks the same way. But China must be aware from its own history of the tenuous dividing line between defensive and offensive capabilities and of the consequences of sparking an unrestrained arms race. I would have thought that would have been something that is a real cause for concern.
Well, I really have nothing to add to what I've said. I think they will. There'll be words, but there won't be war.
There's no doubt, Mr. Hawke, that you're an expert, or you've got a great deal of feeling for the Chinese nation. And myself, as a witness of the development of China, I have great respect for them. However, like any successful organisation, egos are developed. With China as a centralised entity of management, egos must exist and they must be very proud of the developments of their nation. Then you go into the enterprises and the leaders of business within that ecosystem. They themselves, I'm sure, must get brownie points from afar when witnessed for their successes. And that's as it should be. However, in the democracy that we live in, we have governments elected, and these governments evolve, and the nation makes its decisions and votes them in and out. Whereas in the Chinese economy, there is this continuous central entity with ego. And then I look locally, I find ownership instead of investment becoming a situation here. And I have a view that maybe we're letting too much of our nation go to total ownership. And I'd like a view, and maybe you could tell me how you see this evolving.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, it's not accurate, an accurate depiction of the situation in China to say that all the decisions are made there at the centre. There's a great diffusion now. This is the essence of Deng Xiaoping's decision, diffusion of power. And now private enterprise and state-owned enterprise to some extent, but they make important decisions about the economic allocation of resources. And so I don't think you put that accurately. But coming back to the latter part of your question, I get a little bit disturbed when I hear the voices against investment in our resources, whether they be mineral resources or real estate resources, agricultural resources, voices raised against acquisition in those areas by foreigners in general, Chinese in particular. I mean, the fact is that our history has depended upon investment from abroad from day one, and we continue to be reliant on investment. That doesn't mean that we just give open slather. We've got a Foreign Investment Review Board, and I'm in favour of that, but I think that's operated sensibly. I mean, not every application for investment has been granted. National interest considerations are taken into account, but if you look, say, particularly at the area of rural industry and agricultural investment, our farmers haven't got the money and the minister's wherewithal to develop our great capacity, and that's why many farmers are going broke. It's not just a question of drought. I see an enormous opportunity for cooperation between China and Australia in the area of agricultural production. And one of the things that I've been involved in personally, and which has given me much pleasure, is a very big enterprise based in Shanghai, which is now, after all these decades and decades have been talked about in West Australia, developing the Ord River in the north and Kununurra. They're now actually doing it in cooperation with and working closely with the local people. Marvellous investors doing everything they can to maximise employment opportunities for the Aboriginal people. Tremendous. It's a, as we say, as the Chinese say, win-win.
I think we might have to make that our... Oh, you want a quick, very quick one then?
Prime Minister, in the news in Australia a lot lately is also the issue of Chinese national investment in our residential property market. And I wonder, do you have insights as to whether that's as large as we perceive it to be? And secondly, do you think it would be in Australia's interest to curb that lower than what the current Foreign Investment Review restrictions are on larger investments, and not in any way by protecting the Australians' domestic interest in that regard, not damage the national relationship and interests with China?
Well, as you've gathered from what I've said to this point, that I have a prima facie position in favour of investment, but I would I would want to see evidence, more evidence of damage being caused or economic problems being caused by the situation we've reached so far before I would want to do anything else.
Do you think they're going to get soccer right? I just noticed, being the...
Let's get the party clean.
The sporting man, because Xi Jinping's got this great dream, I read just this week, of holding the World Cup, of possibly winning the World Cup. And, have you advised on that, Bob?
No, I haven't.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have have got a very good grasp.
I'll tell you one thing I might
Yes.
say, just on sport, one thing that I am advising them, which they should do, is another area of sport, is thoroughbred racing. No, seriously, I've put in a very significant submission to the authorities up there, surrounded by it. They've got Japan, Macau, all round. They need employment, particularly in rural areas.
Yeah.
And one thing they fundamentally need is the income for a national social security welfare system. So what I'm trying to persuade them is that Australia, we've got the capacity, we will advise them in setting up a thing from the establishment of the thoroughbred studs right through to the racing and the TAB.
TAB.
And they run, the government runs the TAB entirely itself, and all the proceeds are hypothecated to a national welfare security base. And I think I've got them nibbling.
Yes, well, the gambling would go down very well.
Well, they already have a national lottery, but that doesn't do anything. Doesn't do anything for employment.
Fantastic, right? Well, you can see the scope. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please thank Bob Hawke.